Hey everyone, and welcome back to that 90s pod. We're about to take a deep dive into something that might sound a little, a little dry at first glance.
Oh, yeah.
NAFTA.
Okay.
But stick with us, seriously.
Okay.
Because we're going way beyond just like the economic theories and the charts and graphs.
Right.
We're going to talk about how NAFTA, and for anyone who needs a refresher, we're talking about the North American Free Trade Agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. How that actually seeped its way into 90s culture.
Mm-hmm.
Like all the good parts, the bad parts, and some of the totally unexpected parts.
What's fascinating is that NAFTA wasn't just like this straightforward trade deal.
Yeah.
It was more like almost like a lightning rod.
Oh, interesting.
For all the kind of big emotions and anxieties of the 90s.
Oh,
know?
like it really tapped into that.
It did. It landed right in the middle of this crazy time.
Yeah.
The Cold War was over. The internet was blowing up. Everyone was figuring out how to use email.
Right.
But there was also all this anxiety about what globalization really meant. Mm-hmm.
Like for everyday people, you know?
Yeah.
And NAFTA kind of became this symbol of that whole whirlwind.
Okay, so it's like NAFTA kind of bottled up the mood of the decade.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it had this weird duality to it.
Okay.
On the one hand, you had all this excitement about breaking down borders, more trade between countries, new opportunities.
Right.
But on the other hand, there were some very real anxieties about jobs going overseas,
Yeah.
factories closing,
Oh, yeah.
and this feeling that the world was changing too fast.
I totally get that.
Yeah.
My family, I remember them being super worried about NAFTA back in the day.
Oh, yeah.
My uncle worked at a furniture factory, and like every time we got together for family dinners or whatever, the fear that his job would just disappear
Right.
because of NAFTA, it was like this constant topic of conversation. It
Yeah.
felt like this huge looming thing that was going to change everything.
And honestly, that fear wasn't unfounded.
Yeah.
A lot of industries did struggle, especially manufacturing.
But at the same time, you had other sectors like tech that were absolutely booming.
Right.
It's important to remember that the 90s were also a time of massive technological advancement. And NAFTA's role in all of that, well, it's pretty complex.
It's like this tangled knot of economics and politics and even pop culture, right?
Totally. And all those different opinions and narratives about NAFTA really played out in how people talked about it, whether they were like at the dinner table or even in the movies.
Oh, interesting.
Like you had the pro-NAFTA side arguing that it would make North America more competitive globally, create jobs, and even lead to things like a Latin pop explosion, you know, more cultural exchange and all that.
Okay, I like that side.
And then there was the con side that was really worried about things like companies taking advantage of workers in Mexico, environmental damage, and the U.S. losing its manufacturing base.
Yeah, for sure. It was a super heated debate.
It definitely was.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this era so fascinating to look back on, you know?
I know. It's so interesting.
NAFTA wasn't just about changing trade rules on paper. It was about this much deeper shift in how people saw the world and their place in it. It was about identity, culture, and this kind of uncertainty about the future.
Okay, so before we go any further, we want to give a shout out to all you listeners out there.
Of course.
If you're enjoying this trip back to the 90s with us, make sure to hit that subscribe button.
Yes.
And tell your friends about that 90s pod. We've got so many more 90s deep dives planned.
We do.
And you won't want to miss any of them.
All right, now back to NAFTA and how it affected culture.
Okay.
One way it really played out was in the movies.
Well, really?
Think about a movie like The Mexican.
Oh, yeah, with Brad Pitt and Julia Roberts?
Yeah. It came out a few years after NAFTA went into effect.
Right.
But it still tapped into some of that tension in U.S.-Mexico relations that NAFTA brought to the forefront.
That's true. It wasn't like explicitly about NAFTA or anything.
Yeah.
But the whole vibe of the movie, the drug cartels, the cross-border chase, definitely reflected some of the anxieties people had about Mexico.
Exactly.
At the time.
Another interesting angle is how NAFTA kind of fueled the rise of bicultural identities.
Oh, okay.
As trade and migration between the U.S. and Mexico increased, more and more people found themselves living in both worlds.
Right. It's not just about goods crossing borders.
Right.
It's about people and ideas and
music.
Oh, and music too, yes.
And that cultural mixing led to some really interesting art in the 90s.
Like what?
Think about the explosion of Latin pop music,
Oh, yeah.
with artists like Selena and Ricky Martin
Huh.
becoming global superstars.
Totally.
NAFTA played a role in creating a wider audience for them, for sure.
Oh, for sure. And it wasn't just music. It was fashion. It was food, even language.
Yeah.
Like, all these things were blending together.
Totally.
It's like NAFTA accidentally created this cultural melting pot.
It kind of did.
Wow.
And speaking of surprises, NAFTA also had some totally unexpected outcomes
Oh.
that often get overlooked.
Oh, here's where it gets good.
Yeah.
Lay it on me.
Okay, so for one, even though it did boost trade between the three countries, NAFTA stayed surprisingly unpopular throughout the 90s.
Really?
There was a poll in 1995 that showed that over half of Americans
Yeah.
thought NAFTA would actually hurt the U.S. economy.
Wow, that is wild. I guess it just shows how much fear and uncertainty there was around globalization back then, huh?
It does.
But hey, on a more positive note, we got that Latin pop explosion out of it, right?
Ray, that was a pretty awesome side effect of NAFTA for sure.
Totally.
And speaking of surprises,
Okay.
let's talk about agriculture for a second.
Okay.
When NAFTA was being negotiated,
Yeah.
Mexican farmers were understandably kind of nervous.
Well, yeah. U.S. agriculture was a powerhouse back then.
It was.
How did they deal with that?
Well, they came up with a phased implementation plan for certain agricultural products.
Okay.
This gave Mexican farmers more time to adapt
Oh, that's good.
and kind of level the playing field.
So it wasn't just like, open the floodgates, everybody fend for yourself.
No, not at all. They recognized that a one-size-fits-all approach wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Different sectors would be impacted in different ways,
Take a curse.
and some would need more time to adjust. Honestly, it's a good lesson for trade deals today, too.
I was just thinking that. That's such a good point. It shows that these agreements are way more nuanced
They are.
than people think, you know.
Right.
It's not just about lowering tariffs and calling it a day.
Wait.
It's about thinking through all the potential consequences
Yeah.
and trying to minimize the bad ones.
Exactly. And this brings us to another surprising outcome of NAFTA,
Okay?
its impact on education.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
NAFTA had impact on education, too.
It did. They actually launched something called the NAFTA Canada-Mexico Education Initiative
Right.
to help workers learn new skills. Wow.
And to encourage collaboration between schools and universities in all three countries.
Hold on. I never would have thought of that.
It's pretty cool.
That's so interesting.
And this initiative was actually like a precursor to a lot of the cross-border education programs we see today.
Right.
Shows that even back then, people were playing the long game, you know?
Yeah.
They knew that investing in education and workforce development was key for the future
That's smart.
in this more integrated North American economy.
It's very forward-thinking.
It highlights how all these issues are connected, you know?
Totally.
Trade, education, social mobility, it's all part of the same puzzle.
It is. It is. Okay, so we talked about the economics, the cultural impact, even education. But what about the environment?
Oh, yeah.
And labor? Those were big issues back then.
Absolutely huge points of contention.
Yeah.
Alongside NAFTA, there were two other important agreements.
Okay.
The North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation, or NAEC for short.
And the North American Agreement on Labor Cooperation, or NAALC,
Okay.
these were significant because they acknowledged that trade couldn't happen in a vacuum. You can't just ignore the environment or workers' rights.
Yeah.
There had to be systems in place to address the potential issues that could come from increased economic activity.
So they were trying to make sure that free trade wouldn't just benefit big corporations,
Yeah.
but would also protect workers and the environment.
That was the goal,
Yes.
at least in theory. Of course, there were, and still are, debates about how effective those agreements were.
Yeah.
Some argue they didn't have enough power,
Right.
while others say they were a step in the right direction.
Yeah, it sounds like with something as complex as NAFTA, there are always going to be different opinions
For sure.
and debates, you know. It's not a simple black and white issue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the important thing is that NAFTA wasn't just about opening up trade. It was also about trying to manage the social and environmental impacts of globalization.
Okay, well, before we wrap up this deep dive, we want to give another shout out to our amazing listeners.
Yes.
If you're digging this journey back to the 90s, hit that subscribe button and tell your friends about that 90s pod.
Please do. We've got so much more 90s goodness coming your way.
So much more.
And speaking of 90s goodness,
Yes.
I think it's time to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question.
All right, let's hear it.
Okay, given everything we've talked about today, Do you think NAFTA was ultimately a good thing or a bad thing for the 1990s?
Ooh.
And how do you think its legacy is still playing out today?
Whoa, that's a tough one. It's like trying to solve one of those Rubik's Cubes from back in the day.
Right.
So many sides to consider.
Exactly. There's no easy answer.
Yeah.
It's about looking at all the evidence, weighing the different viewpoints, and then coming to your own conclusions.
Well said. That's the perfect note to end on.
It is.
We've covered a lot today, from economic anxieties to Latin pop superstars.
It's been a ride.
It has. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into NAFTA and the 90s.
Of course.
It's been a blast exploring this blast from the past with you.
It has.
We'll catch you next time with another deep dive into the decade that brought us grunge, dial-up internet,
Yeah.
and of course NAFTA.
Until then, keep those 90s vibes alive.
Seg.
For one, even though it did boost trade between the three countries significantly, NAFTA stayed surprisingly unpopular throughout the 90s.
Really?
Yeah, a poll in 1995 showed that over half of Americans
No way.
thought it would actually hurt the U.S. economy.
Wow, that's wild. I guess it just shows how much fear and uncertainty there was around globalization back then.
Right.
But hey, at least we got that Latin pop explosion out of it, right?
Yeah, for sure. That was a pretty awesome side effect of NAFTA.
Totally. And speaking of surprises,
What?
let's talk about agriculture.
Okay.
When they were negotiating NAFTA,
Yeah.
Mexican farmers were understandably a little nervous.
Oh, yeah, for sure. U.S. agriculture was a powerhouse back then.
It was, so how did they deal with that?
Well, they actually came up with this
Oh, yeah.
phased implementation plan for certain agricultural products,
Okay.
which gave Mexican farmers more time to adapt and level the playing field a bit.
So it wasn't just like, okay, open the borders and let the chips fall where they may.
No, not at all.
Okay.
They recognized that a one-size-fits-all approach
Right.
wasn't going to work for every industry.
Makes sense.
Different sectors would be impacted in different ways, and some needed a gentler transition.
That's a great point.
It's a good lesson for trade deals today, honestly.
I was just thinking that. It shows that these agreements are way more nuanced
They are.
than a lot of people think. It's not just about, slashing tariffs.
No.
It's about thinking about the consequences, all the potential consequences,
It is.
and trying to mitigate the negative ones.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another surprising outcome of NAFTA,
Okay.
its impact on education.
Wait, what? NAFTA had an impact on education.
It did. They actually launched the NAFTA Canada-Mexico Education Initiative
wow.
to help workers develop new skills
Okay.
and to encourage collaboration between schools and universities in all three countries.
Hold on. I never would have guessed that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
That's so interesting.
And this initiative was actually like a precursor to a lot of the cross-border education programs we see today. It shows that even back then, people were thinking about the long game,
Yeah.
They knew that investing in education and workforce development was key to long-term success
Right.
in this more integrated North American economy.
That's pretty forward thinking for the time.
It was.
Yeah.
And it highlights how all these issues are really interconnected,
Totally.
Trade, education, social mobility,
Yeah.
it's all part of the same big picture.
It is. Okay, so we've talked about the economic side of things, the cultural impact,
Right.
even education. But we can't forget about the environment and labor, right?
Yeah.
Those were huge points of contention back then.
Absolutely. Huge.
Yeah.
Alongside NAFTA, there were two other important agreements.
Okay.
The North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation,
Hmm.
NAAEC for short,
Okay.
and the North American Agreement on Labor Cooperation,
Okay.
NALC.
Right.
These were significant because they acknowledged that trade couldn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
You can't just ignore the environment or workers' rights.
Of course.
There had to be ways to address those issues
Yeah.
that could arise from increased economic activity.
So it sounds like they were trying to make sure that this whole free trade thing wouldn't just benefit big corporations, but would also protect workers and the environment.
Yeah, that was the idea,
Okay.
at least in theory.
Right, in theory. Right.
Of course, there were and still are debates about how effective they really were.
Hmm.
Some argue they didn't have enough teeth, while others say they were a step in the right direction.
It sounds like with something as complex as NAFTA, there are always going to be different perspectives
For sure.
and debates, It's not a simple black and white issue.
It's not.
Yeah.
But what's important to remember is that NAFTA wasn't just about opening up trade.
Right.
It was also about trying to manage the social and environmental impacts.
Okay.
of globalization.
Well, before we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
we want to give another shout out to our amazing listeners out there.
Yes.
If you're digging this journey back to the 90s, don't forget to hit that subscribe button.
Yes, please.
And spread the word about that 90s pod.
We appreciate you guys.
We do, and we've got so much more 90s goodness coming your way, so stay tuned.
And speaking of 90s goodness,
Yeah.
I think it's time to leave our listeners with the final thought-provoking question to ponder.
Okay, hit me with it.
All right. Given everything we've talked about today,
Mm-hmm.
do you think NAFTA was ultimately a force for good or bad in the 1990s?
Ooh, that's a good one.
And how do you think its legacy is still playing out in our world today?
Wow, that's a tough one.
I know, right?
It's like trying to solve one of those Rubik's Cubes from back in the day.
It is.
So many different angles to think about.
Right. There's no easy answer.
No.
It's all about looking at the evidence, weighing the different viewpoints, and coming to your own conclusions.
Well said. That's a perfect note to end on.
I think so, too.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from economic anxieties to Latin pop superstars.
It's been a wild ride.
It has been a wild ride through the 90s.
It has.
Well, that about wraps it up for our deep dive on NAFTA and its impact on the 90s.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, I feel like we've gone through so many twists and turns.
We have.
Like from economic anxieties to Latin pop and everything in between.
So much to unpack.
I know, right?
But even though, we're focusing on a trade deal from the 90s, I think those ripple effects are still happening today.
Oh, totally. That question we asked about whether NAFTA was, ultimately good or bad. Right.
It's not just a history question.
Yeah,
it's something we're still dealing with in so many ways.
Yeah, I agree.
It's kind of like, those butterfly clips we all wore.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Back in the 90s, what seemed like just a silly trend then
Yeah.
actually had this kind of lasting impact.
I know. Who knew?
Exactly. It's like those little things can have these big effects.
I love that.
And that's what makes exploring this decade so interesting.
It is.
It's closer than we think,
Yeah.
But it still has so much to teach us about the world today.
Couldn't agree more. Well, folks, that's all the time we have for this episode of That 90s Pod.
It is.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Into the decade that brought us grunge, dial-up internet,
Oh, yeah.
and, of course, NAFTA.
Keep those 90s vibes alive, everyone.
See you later.